ever seen a bride or groom realize, I don't love them too late? Story 1. The soft hum of whispered excitement filled the grand ballroom, chandeliers casting golden light on a sea of elegantly dressed guests. Everything was perfect. The flowers, the music, the delicate aroma of vanilla and roses. A dream wedding. Yet, in the midst of it all, Caleb stood frozen at the altar, his hands trembling, the weight of 1,000 decisions pressed against his chest. His bride Eliza stood before him, radiant, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of happiness. The officiant had just spoken the words that should have sealed their forever. "Do you take this woman?" Caleb's mind screamed at him, a voice louder than the applause that would soon follow. "I don't love her." It had taken him this long, standing under the gaze of his family, his friends, and Eliza, to finally admit what he had been denying for months. He loved her, but not in the way a husband should, not in the way that makes forever seem like a blessing instead of a burden. His heart pounded as silence stretched. Eliza's smile faltered, her fingers gripping the bouquet tighter. He could see the confusion flickering behind her hopeful eyes. The murmurs in the room were rising now, guests exchanging uncertain glances. Caleb swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. A sharp, shaky breath escaped Eliza's lips as she stepped closer. Caleb, the question hung between them, fragile, desperate. He turned slightly, scanning the crowd as if someone, anyone, could offer him an escape. His mother's worried expression, his father's clenched jaw, his best friend Daniel, looking as though he already knew. Then his eyes found someone else. A woman near the back, half hidden behind a pillar, her face a mirror of his own internal agony. Emma. The world shifted. Emma, his best friend, the one who had laughed with him in his darkest moments, the one who had always been there, the one he had never dared to imagine a future with, until now. The realization hit like a lightning strike. It was always her. Eliza followed his gaze. The shift in her posture told him she understood, even before he found the strength to say it. "I'm so sorry, Eliza." A tear slipped down her cheek. And then, with a quiet nod, she let him go. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Caleb barely noticed. He was already moving, pushing through the stunned guests, toward the only person he had ever truly loved. Toward Emma, toward his real forever. Story 2. The train was nearly empty when Evelyn stepped inside, her coat damp from the drizzle outside. She slid into a seat near the window, watching the raindrops race down the glass, merging and separating like fleeting moments of time. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not on this train, not in this city, not after everything that had happened. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she pulled her bag closer, its weight a reminder of what she carried. She didn't expect to see anyone she knew. That was part of the plan. Disappear quietly, slip away before the past could catch up. But then she saw him. At the far end of the car, a man sat reading a newspaper, his face partially hidden. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Even from here, even after all these years, she recognized him. Noah. She turned sharply toward the window, her pulse quickening. Could he have seen her? Was he even looking? Her mind raced through the possibilities. Had he followed her? Was it coincidence? A rustle of movement. Footsteps approaching. She tightened her grip on her bag. The train jolted forward, sending a shiver through the seats. She heard him before she saw him. His voice low, careful. "Evelyn." She turned slowly, heart hammering. His eyes met hers, filled with something unreadable. Concern, regret, maybe even relief. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. A bitter smile touched his lips. "Neither should you." A silence stretched between them, thick with all the words left unsaid over the years. Evelyn swallowed hard. "How did you find me?" Noah exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I never stopped looking." The train rumbled on, carrying them into the unknown. She had spent so long running. Maybe it was time to stop. Story 3. Lena drove down the empty road, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery hues. The town ahead was barely more than a collection of forgotten buildings, abandoned long ago, left to decay under the relentless desert winds. But she wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here for answers. The old gas station at the town's entrance stood like a skeletal monument, its sign swinging with a creaky protest in the breeze. Lena parked her car beside it, stepping out into the dry, dusty air. Every step she took kicked up small clouds of sand, muffling the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. She had read about this town, how it had been suddenly abandoned decades ago. No logical explanation, no known disaster, just an entire population that had vanished overnight. Now, she was determined to uncover the truth. She moved toward what had once been the town square. Faded posters clung stubbornly to the walls of a diner, their edges curled and brittle. The door creaked open at her touch. Inside, the scent of time and decay clung to every surface. A half-eaten meal still sat on the counter, petrified in place as if someone had only just left. A chill ran through her. She wasn't alone. A soft rustling echoed from the kitchen. Lena froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. She reached into her bag, fingers closing around the flashlight she had brought, and clicked it on. A flickering beam cut through the darkness. Something moved in the shadows. "Hello," she called, forcing steadiness into her voice. Silence. Then, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Lena spun, the flashlight beam trembling. A figure stood in the doorway, half shrouded in darkness. An old man, his face lined with age and something deeper. Something haunting. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep her fear in check. The man shook his head. "Turn around. Leave now, before it wakes up." Lena's breath hitched. "Before what wakes up?" He pointed behind her, toward the diner's back door. A low rumble vibrated through the air, a sound that didn't belong. She had come for answers, but now she wasn't sure she wanted them. Story 4. The clock on the dashboard blinked 2:47 a.m. as Mark drove through the winding mountain road. The headlights cut through the thick fog, illuminating patches of towering pines that loomed like silent sentinels. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing on his chest like an iron hand. This was not how the night was supposed to go. He glanced at the passenger seat. Sarah sat there, knees pulled to her chest, her fingers trembling around the edges of her jacket. She had barely spoken since they fled the cabin, since the frantic phone call that had shattered their reality. "Do you think he's still following us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Darkness. Nothing but the fog and the twisting road behind them. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was there, just beyond the reach of the headlights. "We just have to get to the next town," he said, more to reassure himself than her. "We'll find a motel, figure out what to do next." Sarah nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. Mark turned his focus back to the road, pushing the car a little faster, desperate to put more distance between them and the nightmare they had left behind. Then the radio crackled. A static-laden voice broke through, warbled and distant. "You can't run forever." Mark's blood ran cold. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to the volume knob, twisting it frantically. The static vanished, leaving only the eerie hum of white noise. A cold sweat broke out on Mark's brow. That voice, it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. A sudden flash of light in the mirror. Headlights. Rapidly approaching. Sarah saw them too. "Mark, I see it," he cut her off, slamming his foot down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the wet pavement. The headlights behind them grew brighter, closing the distance at an impossible speed. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to let them go. Story 5. The old chapel stood at the edge of the forest, hidden behind a curtain of overgrown ivy. It had been abandoned for decades, yet its presence remained, a whisper of something lost, something waiting. Eleanor stepped carefully through the decayed doorway, her flashlight flickering against the cracked stone walls. The air smelled of damp wood and forgotten prayers. She wasn't supposed to be here, but the letter had been clear. A come alone. Midnight dot. She had found the note slipped under her apartment door, written in an elegant but unfamiliar hand. Curiosity had drawn her here. Fear kept her heart pounding in her chest. A gust of wind pushed through the shattered stained glass windows, casting jagged patterns of moonlight onto the wooden pews. The place should have been silent, but Eleanor heard something, a faint hum, almost like a voice resonating from the altar. She moved forward, her footsteps muffled by dust and age. At the center of the chapel stood a single chair, its dark wood gleaming as though untouched by time. A book lay open on its seat, pages fluttering though there was no breeze inside. Eleanor hesitated before reaching for it. As soon as her fingers touched the fragile parchment, the humming ceased. A shadow, her breath hitched. From the darkness behind the altar, a figure emerged. Tall, draped in a tattered cloak, its face obscured by the dim light. "You answered the call," the figure murmured, voice deep and solemn. Eleanor's grip tightened on the book. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head slightly. "The keeper of what was lost. And you, Eleanor Carter, are here to decide its fate." Her name on the stranger's lips sent a chill down her spine. "I don't understand." "You will." The figure stepped closer, the flickering light revealing an outstretched hand. "But first you must choose." Eleanor's heart pounded. She hadn't come looking for destiny, but it had found her anyway. Story 6. The last train of the night was nearly empty as Daniel stepped onto the platform. The station was eerily quiet, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows over the worn-out benches. He had missed his usual train, and now, only this one remained. heading toward a place he had promised himself he would never return to. As the doors slid shut behind him, he walked down the aisle, choosing a seat near the back. A few passengers sat scattered throughout the car, their faces either buried in newspapers or illuminated by the cold glow of their phones. Daniel exhaled and glanced at his reflection in the window. The dark tunnels rushed past, creating a ghostly effect. Just as he was about to close his eyes, he noticed something strange. Someone sitting alone in the farthest seat, staring directly at him. A woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gray coat, her dark hair neatly tied back. But it was her eyes that unsettled him. They were unblinking, locked onto his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He turned away, forcing himself to ignore her presence. Yet an uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. When he dared to glance again, she hadn't moved. Her gaze was still fixed on him. The train rumbled forward, and an announcement crackled over the speakers. Next stop, Graybrook. Daniel stiffened. Graybrook didn't exist anymore. Not since the fire. Not since a whisper drifted through the car. He turned sharply, but none of the other passengers seemed to react. You shouldn't have come back, Daniel. His blood turned to ice. He whipped his head toward the woman, but she was gone. Only the empty seat remained, the fabric slightly indented as if someone had just been sitting there. The train screeched to a halt. The doors slid open to reveal a platform covered in thick fog. No signs, no people, only Graybrook. His past had finally caught up to him. Story 7. Lara had always been drawn to old houses, their secrets hidden beneath layers of dust and time. The estate on Blackwood Hill was no different. A century-old mansion, abandoned yet untouched, as if it had been waiting for someone to return. She ran her fingers over the intricate carvings on the banister as she climbed the grand staircase. The air smelled of aged wood and something else, something faint, almost like candle wax. The floorboards creaked under her weight, echoing through the hollow corridors. It was in the library that she found it. A door, seamlessly built into the bookshelf, barely noticeable if not for the tiny iron handle nestled between the spines of forgotten tomes. Lara hesitated. Every old house had its mysteries, but this one felt different. This one felt personal. Her breath hitched as she pulled the handle. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow passageway cloaked in dark. A draft of cool air swept past her, carrying the scent of something ancient. With hesitant steps, she moved forward, flashlight in hand, illuminating the stone walls that stretched ahead. The passage twisted and turned, leading her downward, deeper into the mansion's forgotten belly. At the end of the tunnel, a wooden chest sat beneath the dim light of a single hanging lantern. Lara's pulse quickened. Dust covered the lid, undisturbed for decades, yet the lock was missing. An open invitation. She lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of letters, bound in a ribbon, their ink faded but legible. The topmost one bore her last name. Hands trembling, she unfolded it. Lara, if you are reading this, then the house has called you home. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't the first to find this place, but something told her she might be the last. Story 8. The fog clung to the streets like a living thing, curling around lampposts and seeping into alleyways. Olivia pulled her coat tighter, her breath forming ghostly wisps in the cold night air. The town of Ravenshire had always been eerie, but tonight it felt different, as if the fog wasn't just concealing the streets, but something else. She walked briskly, her footsteps muffled against the damp cobblestones. The letter in her pocket felt heavier than it should. It had arrived that morning, unmarked, unsigned, but addressed to her. Come to the old clock tower at midnight. You need to know the truth. Olivia had tried to ignore it, but curiosity had won. Now, as the town's massive clock loomed ahead, she wondered if she had made a mistake. A soft whisper broke the silence. She stopped, heart hammered. The sound had come from the fog itself, a low murmur, like voices speaking just out of reach. She turned, but the street behind her was empty. She reached the tower's entrance and hesitated. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. Swallowing hard, she stepped inside, the old wood creaking beneath her weight. The air smelled of dust and time. Moonlight filtered through a broken window, casting jagged shadows across the spiral staircase leading upward. Another whisper drifted down from above, clearer this time. Her name, Olivia. Her pulse spiked. She gripped the railing, forcing herself to climb. Each step echoed in the stillness. As she reached the top, she saw a figure standing by the massive gears of the clock. A man, his face hidden by shadow. You came? He said softly. Olivia's fingers tightened around the letter. Who are you? The figure stepped forward. The moonlight caught his face, and Olivia's breath caught in her throat. It was her father. But her father had died 10 years ago. Story 9. Ethan adjusted the strap of his backpack as he stepped into the ruins of Blackthorn Manor. The once grand estate had been left to decay, its walls crumbling under the weight of forgotten history. A dense mist clung to the ground, curling around broken pillars and shattered glass. It was the perfect place for the answers he sought. He had followed the clues for months, piecing together fragments from old newspaper articles and whispers from locals who claimed the manor was cursed. But he wasn't interested in ghost stories. He was here for something tangible, his great-grandfather's lost journal, a book rumored to contain secrets that could change everything. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wood and thyme. Ethan switched on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the dust-filled air. The great hall stretched before him, its chandeliers reduced to rusted skeletons. He moved carefully, avoiding the debris that littered the floor. Then he saw it. A desk at the far end of the room, half buried beneath collapsed beams. His pulse quickened. If the journal had survived, it would be there. He hurried over, tugging away rotting planks, sending a cloud of dust into the air. And then, his fingers brushed against something smooth. Leather. A book? He pulled it free, his breath catching as he saw the initials embossed on the cover. J.T. James Thornton, his great-grandfather. But before he could open it, a soft creak echoed through the room. Ethan froze. He wasn't alone. Slowly he turned, his flashlight sweeping across the hall. Shadows danced against the peeling wallpaper. But there was no one there, no movement. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed down on him like a weight. A whisper drifted through the silence. "Leave now." The words sent a chill racing down his spine. He tightened his grip on the journal, knowing that whatever was in its pages was worth the risk, and that someone, or something, didn't want him to read it. Story 10. Sophia stepped carefully into the dimly lit corridor, her fingers grazing the cold stone walls. The old estate had been abandoned for years, but she had always been drawn to its mysteries. Tonight, she was finally inside. Her footsteps echoed as she moved deeper into the house, past dusty portraits with hollow eyes and furniture draped in white sheets. At the end of the hall, she found a door unlike the others, tall, black, and adorned with intricate carvings of twisting vines and unfamiliar symbols. She hesitated, her heart pounding, before pushing it open. Inside was a room lined with mirrors. Dozens of them, of varying shapes and sizes, covered the walls. They reflected her image in an unsettling way, slightly off, like the glass held onto echoes of past visitors. Sophia stepped forward, her breath shallow. Something felt wrong. The mirrors weren't just reflecting, they were watching. A whisper curled through the air. "You finally came." She spun around, but the room was empty. The door had shut behind her. When she turned back to the mirrors, her reflection no longer matched her movements. Her mirrored self stood still, staring back at her with wide, knowing eyes. Panic seized her. She reached for the door handle, but her fingers met only solid wood. She was trapped. The reflections in the mirrors began to shift, their faces warping, distorting, as if trying to push through the glass. "Let me out," she gasped. The mirrors trembled. Cracks began to spread across their surfaces, the whispers growing louder, surrounding her in a cacophony of voices. Then, silence. One by one, the mirrors shattered. Sophia shielded her face as shards of glass rained down, cutting through the air like falling stars. When she opened her eyes, the room was empty. No mirrors, no whispers. Just a blank, endless space. And in the farthest corner, a new reflection. Her own, stepping forward, smiling. Story 11. Emma had always known there was something strange about her grandmother's house. It creaked too much, the shadows lingered too long, and sometimes when the wind howled through the trees, she swore she could hear whispers coming from the attic. Her grandmother Eleanor had never let her go up there. "Nothing but dust and old memories," she would say. But the night Eleanor passed away, Emma found herself standing before the attic door, a single iron key in her hand. The door groaned open, revealing steep wooden stairs that disappeared into the darkness above. With her heart pounding, she climbed, flashlight in hand, illuminating forgotten trunks, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and furniture draped in ghostly white sheets. Then she saw it, a tall, ornate mirror standing against the far wall, untouched by dust. Unlike the others in the house, it was flawless, its gilded frame gleaming in the dim light. As she stepped closer, her own reflection seemed to flicker, just for a second. A trick of the light, she told herself. Then it happened again. Emma reached out, fingers barely brushing the cool glass, when a whisper echoed through the attic. "You found me!" She spun around, but the attic was empty. The whisper hadn't come from behind her. It had come from inside the mirror. Emma's reflection didn't move. It stood frozen, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Then, slowly, the reflection raised a hand and pressed it against the other side of the glass. Emma stumbled back, her breath hitching in her throat. The mirror trembled, and for a moment she thought she saw another figure standing just behind her reflection, a shadowy silhouette with eyes that glowed like embers. The attic door slammed shut. The whisper came again, softer this time. "Let me out." Emma wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She knew, deep down, that she had just uncovered a secret meant to stay hidden. And now, the mirror wasn't letting her go. Story 12. James had always been drawn to the stories of the old railway tunnels beneath the city. They were supposed to be abandoned, sealed off decades ago, but some claimed they weren't as empty as they seemed. Tonight, he would find out for himself. Armed with only a flashlight and his notebook, he slipped through the rusted fence behind the old train yard. The air inside the tunnel was damp and heavy, the scent of mildew thick in his nostrils. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, swallowed up by the darkness ahead. He followed the faint remains of old tracks, the walls lined with crumbling brick and faded graffiti. After 20 minutes of careful exploration, he saw something strange, a metal door embedded into the tunnel wall. It shouldn't have been there. No maps had ever mentioned it. James hesitated, then reached for the handle. It was ice cold, but it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway lit by flickering fluorescent lights. He stepped inside, heart hammered. The corridor led him to a large underground chamber, filled with rows of rusted lockers and discarded equipment. Old newspapers littered the floor, their pages yellowed with age. As he bent down to pick one up, a voice echoed from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here." James froze. He turned slowly, shining his flashlight toward the sound. A figure stood at the far end of the room, half hidden in the dim light. He couldn't make out the face, but the stance was unmistakable. Watching, waiting. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. The figure took a step forward. "Turn back, now." The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly, flickering once, then plunged the room into total darkness. James's breath caught. The sound of footsteps echoed closer. He fumbled for his flashlight, but before he could turn it back on, a whisper reached his ear, closer than it should have been. "You were never supposed to find this place." The door behind him slammed shut. Story 13. Lena had heard the stories about the house on Hollowbrook Lane. A house that appeared only once every 10 years, standing in the same empty lot where nothing but wild grass usually grew. Some said it was a trick of the mind. Others swore it was real. Tonight she would find out for herself. The moon hung low as she approached the vacant lot, her breath forming clouds in the chilly air. She had walked past this place dozens of times before, but now something was different. The air was heavier, the streetlights flickered as if hesitating to shine too brightly. Then, as she turned the corner, there it was. The house, tall and old, its windows dark, its wooden exterior warped with age. Her pulse quickened. No one had built anything here, yet the house stood as though it had never left. The front door was slightly ajar, inviting, daring. Lena hesitated, but curiosity won over fear. She stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. Pushing the door open, she entered. Inside, the air smelled of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. The furniture was draped in white sheets, untouched, as if waiting for its owners to return. A grandfather clock ticked in the hall, though no one had been here to wind it. She walked further inside, her footsteps muffled by a thick layer of dust. Then, she noticed something strange. There were no reflections in the mirrors. She waved a hand in front of one, but the glass remained empty. A whisper broke the silence. "Why did you come?" Lena spun around, her heart hammered. The voice had come from upstairs. Against every instinct, she climbed the creaking staircase, reaching a dimly lit hallway lined with doors. One door stood slightly open, candlelight flickering inside. She stepped forward, pushing it open. A single chair sat in the center of the room. On it, a notebook lay open, her own name written across the top of the page. Before she could move, the door slammed shut behind her, and the house began to fade. Story 14. Elliot never believed in ghosts, but the house at 42 Ravenwood Lane had a reputation that even he couldn't ignore. The locals called it the Midnight House because, as the stories went, a visitor arrived at the same time every night, yet no one ever saw them leave. Curiosity got the better of, and on a crisp autumn night he found himself standing at the front steps. The house loomed above him, its windows dark and lifeless. He pushed the door open. It wasn't locked. A single candle flickered inside, resting on a table in the grand entryway. Someone had been here recently. Elliot stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The house smelled of old wood and forgotten memories. He moved cautiously, each room filled with furniture draped in sheets, frozen in time. Then a sound. Soft footsteps on the second. His heart pounded. He called out, but no one answered. Gripping his flashlight, he climbed the stairs. A long hallway stretched before him, doors lining both sides. One door at the end stood slightly ajar, candlelight flickering from within. He approached and pushed it open. A man sat in a high-backed chair facing the window. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, hands resting on the armrests. "Hello?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't move. Elliot stepped closer, reaching out, but the chair was empty. The candle extinguished in an instant, plunging the room into darkness. Then a whisper, inches from his ear. "You shouldn't have come." Elliot stumbled back, his breath ragged. The door slammed shut behind him. He fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A slow, deliberate knock sounded on the other side. Midnight struck. The air grew impossibly cold. The guest had arrived. Story 15. I was invited to a wedding once, one that never actually happened. It was set in this gorgeous countryside venue, fairy lights draped over trees, everything picture perfect. The bride, Emma, was radiant. The groom, Mark, beaming with pride. Everyone was in their seats waiting for the vows. And then it happened. Emma took a deep breath, looked at Mark, and for a moment, something shifted in her face. It was subtle, but I saw it. Her smile faded, her hands trembled slightly. The officiant asked her to repeat the vows. Silence. "Emma," Mark whispered, concern creeping into his voice. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Emma blinked, as if waking up from a dream, then turned to look at the crowd, at her parents, her friends, at me even. Then she just stepped back. "I can't," she whispered. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Mark looked like he'd been punched in the gut. "Well, what?" he stammered. Emma's hands clenched at her sides. I thought I could do this. I thought I loved you. But I don't. Not the way I should." Someone in the back audibly gasped. Mark's mother had already started crying. But Emma didn't waver. "I love the idea of us," she continued, voice shaking but firm. "I love the memories. I love the comfort. But I don't love you enough to promise forever." Mark's face went blank, his hands slowly lowering from where he had reached for her. The silence was suffocating. And then, without another word, Emma turned and walked down the aisle. Alone. No running. No drama. Just quiet, devastating finality. I don't think I've ever seen anything more heartbreaking or more honest. Story 16. I was at my cousin's wedding when it happened. The ceremony was in this grand old church. Stained glass windows, high ceilings, the whole fairy tale setting. The bride, Lily, looked breathtaking. And the groom, Jake, stood at the altar, waiting for her with that nervous, lovesick expression. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. "They got through the vows," he said. "I do," she hesitated. "Just for a second. But I noticed." Then she looked at Jake. Really looked at him. And suddenly her expression changed, like something inside her shattered. She exhaled shakily. "I can't." The room froze. The officiant blinked. Jake let out a nervous chuckle. "That's funny, babe." She wasn't laughing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the microphone. Jake's face went pale. The guests murmured in confusion. Lily's mother had already stood up from her chair, whispering something frantically to her husband. "What do you mean, you can't?" Jake's voice cracked. Lily's fingers clenched the bouquet like it was the only thing holding her together. "I wanted to believe I loved you the way you love me," she said. "I tried. I thought it would come with time. But it hasn't." Someone in the front row gasped. Jake's best man muttered, "Oh, shh." Jake was shaking his head, blinking rapidly. "We've been together for years, Lil. We planned our life together." "I know," she said. A tear slipped down her cheek. "That's why this is so hard." Silence. Then Jake let out a breathless laugh. Sharp, bitter. "So what? You just realized this now? Right here? In front of everyone?" Lily's lip trembled. "I realized it before," she admitted. "I just kept telling myself I was wrong." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "And now?" She swallowed. "Now I know I'm right." The church felt like it was suffocating. The weight of hundreds of eyes, the unspoken thoughts, the sheer disbelief. Lily turned, bouquet slipping from her fingers, and walked down the aisle. No running, no looking back. Just the sound of Jake's uneven breathing and the echo of a wedding that would never be. Story 17. I was a bridesmaid at my best friend's wedding, standing just a few feet away when everything fell apart. It started out like every other wedding. Nervous laughter, last-minute fixes to the dress, that mix of excitement and stress in the air. The venue was gorgeous, overlooking a lake, the kind of place you'd see in a movie. The ceremony began, and the groom, Daniel, stood at the altar, watching as Olivia walked toward him in her flowing white gown. She was stunning, absolutely breathtaking. But something in her eyes was off. At first, I thought it was nerves. Cold feet? But when she reached the altar and took his hands, I noticed the way she barely met his eyes. The officiant started the vows. Daniel went first, his voice steady, full of love. Then it was Olivia's turn. She hesitated, just for a moment. I felt the shift in the air. Like everyone in the audience collectively held their breath. The officiant prompted her gently, "Olivia?" She blinked rapidly, fingers tightening around Daniel's hands. Her lips parted, and then, "I'm so sorry." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel frowned. "Sorry for what?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Olivia swallowed hard. I thought I could do this. I wanted to, but I can't." Daniel's hands twitched in hers. "What do you mean?" His voice wavered, panic creeping in. "I don't love you the way I should," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I love you as my best friend, as someone I care about deep, but not as my husband, not as forever." The silence was suffocating. Olivia's mom had already started crying. Someone in the back gasped. Daniel looked like she had just knocked the air out of him. "But we planned everything. We've built a life together." "I know," she whispered, "and that's why I was so afraid to admit it." A long, heavy pause. Then, Daniel let out a breath, a sharp, wounded sound. "So, this is it?" Tears streamed down Olivia's face. She nodded, and then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered, "I'm so sorry." Daniel didn't hug her back. He just stood there, frozen, as she slowly pulled away. And then, just like that, she turned around and walked away. No dramatic exits. No running. Just quiet, devastating truth. Story 18. I was sitting in the second row at my coworker's wedding, watching the ceremony unfold like something straight out of a romance. The venue was a stunning garden, sunlight filtering through the trees, flowers everywhere. The bride, Sophie, looked ethereal, and the groom, Matt, was practically glowing as he gazed at her. It was perfect. Too perfect. Then came the vows. Matt went first, pouring his heart out. He spoke about how Sophie changed his life, how he couldn't imagine a future without her. His voice cracked near the end, and Sophie squeezed his hands, smiling soft. Then it was her turn. She opened her mouth, then closed it. A second passed. Then two. A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd. Someone cleared their throat. Matt frowned. "Sophie?" She let out a shaky breath. Her voice caught. "I need a minute." Matt's grip on her hands tightened. "What's wrong?" Her eyes darted around, as if she were searching for an answer that wasn't there. Her lips trembled. "I thought I could do this. I really did." The officiant shifted uncomfortably. The guests exchanged confused glances. Matt's expression darkened. "Sophie, what are you saying?" She blinked rapidly as if holding back tears. "I love you, Matt, but not in the way you deserve. Not in the way that lasts forever." Silence. The weight of her words settled over the garden like a thundercloud. Matt's face fell, his hands dropping to his sides. "You don't mean that." "I do." She took a shaky step back. "I've been lying to myself, trying to force something that isn't real." His jaw clenched. "So you just figured this out? Right now?" Sophie swallowed hard. "No," she admitted. "I knew before, but I was too afraid to say it." His breath hitched, and for a moment he just stood there, like his whole world had just crumbled. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God." Sophie wiped at her eyes. "I'm sorry, Matt." Then, without another word, she turned around and walked away. No dramatic exit, no running, just a quiet, brutal ending to a love that never truly was. Story 19. The wedding was small, intimate, warm, the kind where everyone knew each other. The bride, Anna, looked like something out of a dream, her dress flowing like water, her smile soft but off. I noticed it, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes as she reached the altar. But then she took a breath, steadied herself, and took Liam's hands. The officiant began. Everything went smoothly at first. The usual words, the soft laughter from the guests. Liam's vows were heartfelt, full of promises. He looked at Anna like she was the only person in the world. Then it was her turn. Anna's lips parted, but the words didn't come. Silence. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Liam squeezed her hands, his expression shifting from excitement to confusion. "It's okay," he whispered, barely loud enough for those of us in the front to hear. Anna blinked rapidly, as if shaking herself back to reality. She stopped again. Liam's brows furrowed. "Anna?" Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "I can't." It was barely audible, but the impact was immediate. Liam's grip loosened. "What?" Anna's breath hitched. "I can't marry you." The words landed like a bomb. The guests went completely still. The officiant hesitated, looking between them. Liam laughed, nervous, disbelieving. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." Her voice cracked. His smile vanished. "What are you talking about?" Anna's hands trembled in his. "I wanted this to be real. I wanted to love you the way you love me, but I don't. I don't know if I ever did. A sharp inhale from Liam's mother. A stunned whisper from the best man. Liam took a step back, hands falling to his sides. But his voice broke. We built a life together. Tears slipped down Anna's face. I know. And I convinced myself that was enough. But it's not. Liam stared at her like she had just become a stranger. Why now? Why tell me here, in front of everyone? I kept thinking I'd go through with it, she admitted, that the moment I stood here, it would all make sense. Her voice wavered. But it doesn't. A heavy silence settled over the crowd. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, Anna took one last look at Lee, at the hurt in his eyes, the shock, the heartbreak, and she turned. No running. No dramatic exit. Just slow, steady steps away from the life she almost chose. Story 20. The venue was breathtaking. Golden chandeliers, rows of white roses, the kind of wedding people dream about. The guests sat in quiet anticipation, watching as Emily walked down the aisle, her father by her side. She looked beautiful, but I saw it. Just a flicker, a hesitation in her step. It was subtle, but it was there. When she reached the altar, she smiled at Adam, her fiancé. He smiled back, love written all over his face. The ceremony began. Adam's vows were perfect, honest, raw. He promised her forever, promised to protect and cherish her. Then it was Emily's turn. She inhaled sharply, fingers tightening around his hands. And then she just froze. Seconds passed. Someone coughed. A guest in the back shifted in their seat. The officiant prompted her gently. Emily? She blinked, looked around, almost as if she didn't recognize where she was. Then her gaze landed back on Adam, and something inside her cracked. Her hands slipped out of his. I can't do this. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Adam's smile faltered. What? His voice was barely a whisper. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. I don't love you the way I should. Silence. The weight of her words crushed the air from the room. Adam let out a nervous chuckle. That's not funny, Em. I'm not joking. She shook her head. I wanted to believe I was ready, that this was right. But it's not. His hands clenched into fists. You're realizing this now? His voice was shaking. Emily swallowed hard. I've been realizing it for a while. A murmur ran through the crowd. Adam's mother covered her mouth. The best man just stared, stunned. Adam exhaled sharply. So what? This was all fake? Everything we planned? Everything we dreamed about? Emily wiped at her tears. It was real. But real doesn't mean forever. Adam's jaw tightened. So you just decided to humiliate me? In front of everyone? Her voice broke. I decided to stop lying to you. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then, with slow, quiet steps, Emily turned. No running, no theatrics. Just the sound of her heels clicking against the floor as she walked away from the life she almost chose. Story 21. The wedding was supposed to be perfect. A beach ceremony, sunset in the background, waves gently rolling in. The kind of setting people dream about. Samantha stood at the altar, her white dress flowing in the breeze, fingers laced tightly with Ethan's. From the outside, she looked like the happiest bride in the world. But I saw it. The way she swallowed hard. The way her grip tightened just a little too much. The officiant smiled warmly. Ethan, you may say your vows. Ethan turned to her, eyes full of love. His voice was steady, confident. He promised her forever. Promised to love her in ways she'd never have to question. Then it was her turn. She opened her mouth. And nothing came out. The air around us felt heavier. The guests shifted in their seats. The ocean waves suddenly sounded too loud. The officiant gave her an encouraging nod. Samantha? She blinked rapidly. Then finally she whispered, Ethan squeezed her hands. It's okay, he murmured. Take your time. Her lips parted again, but the words weren't vows. I'm so sorry. A hush fell over the crowd. Someone near the front let out a quiet gasp. Ethan's brows furrowed. Sorry? For what? Samantha took a shaky breath. I can't do this. The silence was suffocating. Ethan let out a small, breathless laugh. Wait, what? She shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. I thought I could. I thought if I loved you enough, the rest would come. Her voice cracked, but I don't love you the way I should. Ethan took a small step back, like the words physically hit him. Samantha, he whispered. We've planned everything. We've built everything. I know, she choked out. That's why this is so hard. The guests whispered among themselves, unsure whether they should be watching this unfold. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharp. You couldn't have told me this before? Before we got here? I kept thinking I'd feel different once I was standing here, she admitted. That it would feel right. His shoulders sank. For the first time, he looked at her differently, like she was a stranger. More silence. Then, slowly, Samantha reached up, brushing a tear from her cheek. She took one last look at Ethan, at the life she was about to walk away from. And then she turned. No running, no theatrics. Just the sound of the waves crashing behind her as she stepped away from the altar, from the guests, from the man who had loved her too much to see the truth. Story 22. The wedding was in a grand ballroom, chandeliers casting a warm glow, soft music playing in the background. It was the kind of wedding that looked like a fairy tale, except fairy tales don't usually fall apart at the altar. I sat in the third row, watching as Rachel and Tom stood before the officiant, hands clasped together. Tom looked at her like she was his entire... But Rachel, she looked different, not nervous, not overwhelmed, just distant. The vows began. Tom went first, his voice full of emotion, talking about how Rachel had changed his life, how he couldn't wait to spend forever with her. He even made a joke that had the guests laughing. Rachel smiled, but only with her lips. Then it was her turn. She took a breath, opened her mouth, and hesitated. A second passed, then two. The officiant gave her a gentle nod. Rachel? Her fingers twitched in Tom's hands. She swallowed hard. And then, barely above a whisper, she said, I can't. The room went dead silent. Tom's expression barely changed at first, like he hadn't fully processed the words. What? He laughed slightly, but it was forced. That's not funny. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I'm not joking. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Tom's hands dropped to his sides. Rachel, what are you saying? His voice cracked. She inhaled shakily. I thought I could do this. I wanted to. She let out a soft, broken laugh. I've spent months convincing myself this was the right choice. A sharp inhale from Tom's mother. The best man glanced away, as if he didn't want to witness what was happening. Tom blinked rapidly. Then why are you saying this now? Rachel wiped at her cheek. Because I kept hoping that the love I have for you would be enough. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But it's not. Tom's jaw clenched. You don't love me? I do, she admitted. But not in the way I should. Silence. A heavy, painful silence that stretched across the entire ballroom. Tom's hands curled into fists. He shook his head slowly. So that's it? You just realized this now? She exhaled. I realized it before, but I didn't want to hurt. Tom let out a bitter laugh, one that didn't match his teary eyes. And this isn't hurting me? Rachel's lips trembled. She took a slow step back. I'm sorry, she whispered. And then, without another word, she turned around and walked away. No dramatic exit, no running, just quiet, irreversible heartbreak. Story 23. The wedding was everything out of a dream. An elegant rooftop ceremony with the city skyline glowing in the background. The air was crisp, the guests dressed in their finest, and the bride, Natalie, stood at the altar with her hands clasped in Noah's. From the outside, it was perfect. But I saw it, the hesitation in her eyes, the way her breath hitched as the officiant began speaking, the way her fingers twitched ever so slightly in Noah's grip. Noah spoke his vows first, his voice steady, filled with so much love it felt like the whole world could feel it. He promised her everything, forever, devotion, laughter, even patience on the days she needed space. Natalie smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Then it was her turn. She opened her mouth, closed it. The officiant waited. The guests sat still, sensing something was off. Even Noah tensed slightly, his hands giving hers a reassuring squeeze. She exhaled. A pause. Noah leaned in, whispering softly, It's okay, but it wasn't. Natalie's hands trembled in his. I can't. Noah's brows furrowed. What? Her lips pressed together. A single tear slipped down her cheek. I can't do this. A sharp inhale came from Noah's mother in the front row. Someone in the back let out an audible gasp. Noah's expression shifted from confusion to something deeper, something breaking. Natalie, what are you saying? Her voice shook. I love you, but I'm not in love with you. Silence. The words hung between them like a storm cloud, suffocating, unshakable. Noah let go of her hands. You're joking. He let out a small, shaky laugh, but his eyes were already wet. You're just nervous. That's all. Natalie shook her head, fresh tears forming. I wanted this to be real. I wanted it so badly. Her breath hitched. But I can't stand here and lie to you. Not when I know you love me more than I love you. Noah blinked rapidly, like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare. Why didn't you tell me before? His voice cracked. I was afraid, the guests whispered among themselves, unsure if they should even be watching this. Noah took a shaky step back. So what now? You just leave? Natalie looked at him, really looked at him. taking in the way his heart was breaking right in front of her. And then she turned. No running. No grand exit. Just the quiet, steady sound of her heels clicking against the rooftop floor as she walked away from the life she almost said yes to.